Welcome to the Insight Meditation community of Charlottesville, Virginia. You can find all of our program offerings and information about our Sangha at www.imeditation.org. We meet weekly on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, currently on the Zoom platform for meditation and a Dharma talk given by one of our teachers. We also meet daily at noon Eastern Time on Zoom for sitting practice. We hope you can join us.
Well, greetings, everyone. It is really lovely to be back here. And it's been a long few years for everybody, but things are changing as they always do. And in preparing for tonight's talk, I didn't quite realize it was almost Easter, which used to be a really exciting time for me as a kid with lots of dyeing eggs and Easter egg hunts. And this would be about the time of year where my mom and my grandma would be boiling a lot of eggs. And hard-boiled eggs are kind of a theme in my family, but not always for the greatest reason. When we see all the images of what's going on halfway across the world, it's a scary time, and it's a scary place to be, to know that we can feel helpless and powerless. But in a way, this has always been there. The certain circumstances change. Both of my grandparents were immigrants that had to escape during wars to America. And my grandmother especially had a lot of trauma as a child. And so she continually lived in fear. And she lived in fear so much so that she got to be where she never left her house. And the only time that she could ever leave her house is if she had a whole bag of hard-boiled eggs with her. So even if we were only going 40 minutes, she had to have extra boots, an extra coat, extra socks, all those hard-boiled eggs, even if it was just 40 minutes away, and even in the summer. So you can imagine what kind of conditions were happening in the station wagon at that point. But that was the only way that we could cajole her into the car. She just lived in so much fear. As a young child, her mother died when she was 4. And then when her 2-year-old brother was left in the 4-year-old's care, he actually burned to death, and she never got over it. But we knew if we had to take grandma somewhere that we better start boiling those eggs. That was the only way we were going to get her in the car. And, as kids, we used to kind of tease her and make fun of it. But obviously, as we grew older and we really understood her story, we had compassion for why she was living in that constant state of fear that something terrible was going to happen. And so in the last few months at Whitehall Meditation, we have been doing a whole series on fear. And I was telling a friend, it's really helped me, in teaching the series, it's really helped me realize how differently I relate to fear than I did, say, 20 years ago or as a kid. And so I was telling this to a friend, and we were having coffee, and she said, well, I always thought that you were fearless. And as I, wanted to spit out my coffee and just say, what are you talking about? I said, you've known me for so long. You've seen me at my worst and maybe a few times my best. And how could you say that? And her answer was just that when we are faced with things that could never be expected, the really, really big things of loss, of unexpected illness and death, and so many hard challenges, she said to her, I seemed like I was pretty grounded. And I could agree with her with that. I think that um, it got me thinking that some of the huge things that happen in life are just too big to fear. It's like when the banks were too big to fail. I think sometimes fear the real huge things that maybe we should be thinking about, we don't. We get so mired down in the small little things that just etch away every day. And so many of those things are based in fear. I tell my daughter when she gets annoyed, I said, what are you afraid of really here? You're acting annoyed, but there might be something deeper here. And a lot of the times it's things that you don't want to deal with, and that it's fear. So in the series that we're still are in at Whitehall, we were using a book called The Book of Fear, written by Sherry Huber. And she comes at fear many different ways. But first, she makes clear that fear can actually never be felt truly in the moment. So when you're really faced with some big catastrophe, all of your energy is really just focused on the next right step. And that's really how it should be. Fear is about the past or the present. We're trying to avoid pain or hurt that we felt before, or we don't want it to happen again. And fear, of course, is it's a mechanism. And I'm sure you've all heard here in other places, all the research they do about what happens when we're in a fearful situation. Our bodies have a whole chemical cascade that happens, and there's really little that we can do to stop that. So that's not the type of fear that I think causes most of us to suffer. I think that if our bodies are truly in danger, those mechanisms take over, and we can trust those. But it's the things when there is no death looming around the corner, where we can act unskillfully because we are letting fear overtake all of our senses. So in a way, if you can't know fear, you really can't know fearlessness. And it's not like there's a way that we're trying to get to being fearless, because I don't think it's possible, but I definitely do know that there are different ways to relate to fear by paying attention to it and not trying to conquer it or push it away. Now, Sherry Huber has this great quote in that book, and it goes like this: being fearless means we stop feeling like we always have to protect what we know. Instead, we can trust that what we need to know will be there when we need it. Being fearless means we stop feeling like we always have to protect what we know. Instead, we can trust that what we need to know will be there when we need it. One of the reasons why this sort of struck me as I thought, well, after, a couple decades of practice here, there is a certain amount of wisdom that you build up. And I'd like to think that the wisdom was some sort of safeguard against being hijacked by fear. I don't know if it really is, but I do know that in some ways our practice becomes a power, so we're not powerless in the face of fear. I'm sure we've all had that feeling when we are just gripped in fear, and it's just squeezes the life out of everything. It shrinks our world, and there's just no way that we can feel joy or open up to what's happening. A lot of things could be happening in the moment, joy, fear, anger, but when we're gripped in fear, we just don't have all of our senses available to us. So I'm going to talk a little bit later about specific ways that when it happens to us, and if we can be aware of what's happening, how we can deal with it. But first, if you all will just for a minute, go shut your eyes and see if you can recall a time way back in your childhood, maybe, where you had that feeling of being fearless, of feeling that feeling of effortlessness, of just feeling joy and feeling like you weren't afraid. And even if it was something that you were doing for the first time, like say jumping off a diving board or climbing a tall tree, that you went ahead in spite of maybe being afraid. And see if you can feel how it feels in your body. Like, is it a buzzy sensation? Is it like a churning? Is it a warm feeling? Just what that exhilaration feels like in your body. For me, I can remember as a kid in the Midwest, riding my bike all summer, feeling the warm breeze in my face, hearing ducks in the pond. And I just felt so free and so connected to everything. Like I felt like I wasn't just me, I was everything. And this feeling of a feeling of not being shrunk by fear, this is where our anchor can be. So you can open your eyes now, but I would encourage you to really think and try to have that feeling imprinted on you, because that is our Buddha nature. It's a touchstone that I have found very helpful when I feel like, you can almost feel fear rising and you almost feel like you start getting out of your body. But just remember that, just like in the meditation, there's always that door within you. It's not a place you have to go. It's just a matter of stilling your awareness. Because fear can give us that awareness, which is just such an interesting thing about it. E.M. Forster from Howard's End has a great quote, and it says, she could not explain in so many words, but she felt like those who prepare for all the emergencies of life beforehand may equip themselves at the expense of joy. So what are we spending all of our energy on instead of the joy? We can't prepare for everything. And so, we can get wise, we can have more wisdom, we can have more moments of stillness and peace, but it's from the doing of it. It's not from all the books that are by your table, which I have too. I have a huge stack. But I think that fear is such a visceral thing that this is our opportunity to really, moment to moment, try to connect with its message and not be afraid of fear. When I think of times in my life that I would say were too big to fear, and I think this is maybe what my friend was referring to, about 5 or 6 years ago, I had terrible chronic headache, just wouldn't go away. Went to all the doctors, no one could find out what it was. Even neurology at UVA just couldn't figure it out. But I was kind of having an earache. And so it was the ENT that said, I'm going to just do this little test. It's probably really rare. It's like not going to show anything, but we're going to do this test. And so I'm sure we've all had those moments where you're kind of waiting for the phone call. You're waiting to see, what information it gives you. And he called and he said, well, guess what? I've only seen this one other time in 30 years. And as soon as you hang up with me, you're going to call the neurosurgeon and you're going to have brain surgery. And it was just the strangest feeling because it was so big. It was nothing that could have been prevented. It was something that hopefully could be taken care of. And there was nothing to do but just sort of play through the part. I got my papers in order. I had to have a couple procedures done. The first one Afterwards, I had to lay completely still for 6 hours so one of my arteries could close. And you better believe I was meditating. I was also listening. I would listen to all the gurneys down the hall. I would see if they had a different pitch, each person as they went by. And I offered metta as each one went by. And it was so interesting because time sort of lost its control during that time. I've never had to be so still for so long. Um, and then when I had the final procedure, they did what they needed to do and everything was fine. And in looking back, it's when I get a little afraid of all the things that could have happened and how it was challenging to go through. But I can tell you that my practice was really my anchor. And um, in a way, I felt so supported by it. That fact that even when I was the focus of whatever the problem was, that I was still able to offer kind wishes and compassion to everybody concerned. So in some ways, that really taught me that, you know, the big stuff that you may fear is not what you need to waste any time on, that you can really trust your practice. So another aspect of this is what happens when fear turns into anxiety. And I've been really interested in seeing the change in people's use of the word. I have a teenage daughter, and through the pandemic, it was like their go-to word. It was like, I have anxiety, I have anxiety. And I said, yeah, we all have it, you know, no surprise. But for it seemed like for her and her friends to be able to put a name to it, maybe without even fully realizing what it means, it was really comforting to them. But they didn't really, from what I've seen, there wasn't anything beyond that, like a way to sort of differentiate. How is this showing up in your life? Is it preventing you from doing something? Is it preventing you from feeling joy? But it seems like they really all connected with this word, anxiety. And one definition of anxiety is the fear of fear, when we get caught in this fear loop and we can't even distinguish what feeling tone is going on. Is something pleasant? Is it unpleasant? Is it neutral? It's just you're sort of stuck. And in those moments, it's tempting to try to just get rid of it, you know, get rid of the fear or the source of anxiety. Like, if only this pandemic would end, everything would be okay. If only this war would end. But we all know that it's not as easy as that. So what did the Buddha teach about fear? He actually talked about it several different suttas. And there's one sutta, the Abhaya Sutta, where he talks about 4 fears. And they mainly have to do with loss and regret: the loss of sensual pleasures, loss of your body, regret for not having led a skillful life, and regret for having doubt of Dharma. And out of all of these, the Buddha urges us to abandon them. But when we feel fear, we can see if we can associate it with one of these 4 things that he talked about. And so I'm going to read a little bit from the sutta itself. So he said, Brahman, there are those who, subject to death, are afraid and in terror of death. And there are those subject to death who are not afraid or in terror of death. And who is the person who, subject to death, is afraid? There is the case of 4 persons. One who is not abandoned passion, desire, thirst, fever, and craving for sensuality. One who is not abandoned passion, desire, thirst, craving for the body. One who has not been skillful, and one who has no certainty for the Dhamma. So then he goes on to say, obviously, if you abandon these craving for these things, and then we don't have to be afraid. And, just as a reminder, the Buddha is never saying to not love or enjoy life or have pleasure or connection. It's the clinging to it that causes our suffering. This relates to what Thich Nhat Hanh says in his book, Free from Fear, which is the Buddha taught that there is no birth or death. Our belief that these ideas about birth and death are real creates a powerful illusion that causes us a great deal of suffering. When we understand that we can't be destroyed, we're liberated from fear. It's a huge relief. We can enjoy life and appreciate it in a new way. We can enjoy life and appreciate it in a new way. I think a lot of us are feeling that coming out of this time. There's been so many levels of insight and understanding to be had from all of us going through the same thing. I mean, it's kind of a interesting thing that the world is going through something and we all know that it's going through it. It's not that we're all in our little communities. We are, but we're also with the whole world. And that access to the knowledge is not something we've ever had before as a species. So it's interesting to see if there's any new level of understanding from it. So how do we find our freedom when we are facing fear? One of the simplest ways is to realize that it's just one of the hindrances that the Buddha talked about, one of the 5 hindrances that arise when the conditions for it, such as we're not paying attention, we're talking too much, we're dwelling on past unskillful actions, we're judging our own progress on the path, when we have an imbalance of concentration and of energy. So that's how this hindrance can arise. Gil Fronsdale has a really great acronym for fear. People seem to like acronyms. It's easy to remember. But his viewpoint is to really make a friend out of fear. So the F of fear would stand for befriending it, to really not try to push it away, to say, okay, it's a messenger. There's something here that I need to pay attention to. He goes on to suggest that the E is for explore. We talk a lot about curiosity, about meeting things with a lighter hand, of not always having to know their meaning, but just having the energy to explore it. The A is for allow it, acknowledge it. This is what's happening. Fear is happening. You don't necessarily have to identify it with I am afraid, but fear is arising, fear is present. And finally, the R, we can release it. We can release identifying with that fear so we can be with it, but we're not clinging to it. And that's how we can really get to know it and have it be our friend. It's, in all my years of dealing in the performing arts, there's some people that get really affected by stage fright. And it's interesting because, some people can still give a great presentation, but they've had to deal with so much stage fright getting there. Whereas other people, it's like a gene, they just don't have it. But the end result is the same, that it is possible to go forward and be in the moment and do what you're doing without not all of this judging around it about how it's going to be. So one of my other favorite suttas where the Buddha talks about fear is actually the Metta Sutta, which is why I wanted to end the meditation with the Metta chant. It's my go-to chant, saying in my mind, whenever I feel afraid, whenever I'm up at 3 in the morning and can't get back to sleep, offering myself and others loving kindness is a really grounding force. And for years, I did that chant, and I didn't realize that the sutta said that the story goes is that he came up with this because the monks were afraid. And the story goes that every year during the rainy season, when he would send the monks for the 3-month retreat, that he would send them into this particular forest. And this particular year, there were forest spirits that were living in the trees, and they weren't really down with having these monks come and, invade their forest and be meditating all day. So the spirits conjured up ghost-like figures, corpses, terrible smells, all in trying to frighten the monks away. The monks ran back to the Buddha and told him of their experience. And this is where the Buddha offered his monks the practice of metta, encouraging them to offer loving kindness to these so-called evil spirits. After hearing their story, the Buddha encouraged them to go back to the forest, and he said, "You went without a weapon, but I'm going to give you this weapon, the Metta Sutta." And he said that they were to go back into the forest and recite the sutta every day, many times. And the monks found that the spirits stopped haunting them and actually grew to protect them. And the metta practice transformed both the monks and the spirits, as well as promoting an appreciative village. So, of course, a lot of these stories, we don't know how word for word true they are, but I can't think of a better way to focus yourself and your mind when you feel afraid. So that's another way that it's helpful to deal with fear. So as we're getting to these ways to deal with fear when we can identify that that's what's happening, there's one other question that I find really useful, and that is to ask yourself, what am I unwilling to feel? What am I unwilling to feel? I think Tara Brach's has this in one of her writings as well, but that's sometimes the scariest place is, what don't I want to feel? I mean, we really cannot have control over most situations in our lives. And so when those things come up that we are telling a story to ourselves that we are powerless, we may not have control, but we are not powerless. What am I unwilling to feel? So again, it's not so much your physical safety, but your emotional safety that can feel most threatening and cause the most suffering. So another reason to ask yourself that question is that it really gets to the root of how much fear may be contributing to your suffering. It's not going to kill you to try to look at fear, at why you're afraid of something. It can do the opposite if we're willing to really face what that root of suffering may be. And in contrast, the root of happiness is when we can find that open door that we did in the meditation, being open to the present moment and having confidence that our practice is going to support us and be there for us when we need it. So we don't have to hold so tightly the outcome of every single situation. So finally, I was going to, I would love to see if anyone has questions or comments or any discussion. But I'm actually, one of my new projects, I was asked to contribute to a musical that they're doing about the Prophet by Khalil Gibran, because it just became public domain. And so they contacted a bunch of writers, and they said, take one of his sayings or one of his chapters from his books and set it to music. So I don't know what will happen with it. I'm sure in the next few years it will, something will happen with it. But I've always loved his writings as a kid. My mother had all of his books, and here's a poem that he wrote about fear. You are here. It is said that before entering the sea, a river trembles with fear. She looks back at the path she has traveled from the peaks of the mountains, the long winding road crossing forests and villages. And in front of her, she sees an ocean so vast that to enter there seems nothing more than to disappear forever. But there is no other way. The river cannot go back. Nobody can go back. To go back is impossible in existence. The river needs to take the risk of entering the ocean, because only then will fear disappear. Because that's where the river will know it's not about disappearing into the ocean, but of becoming the ocean. So thank you once again for sharing this time with me.